Hello, everyone. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. And I am here on a regular Friday fireside chat, which, just to remind you, is being recorded. So if you like it, you can tell your friends about it afterwards, and you'll come find us on YouTube. And don't say anything you don't want your great Aunt Nellie finding out about. That's my just general guidance. My guest this week is Steve Dennis, who is the author of this terrific book called Leaders Leap. So former big company marketing executive strategist, today a strategy consultant, author of this book, plus one other one on the topic of retail. And I'm really, really pleased that you found the time to come join us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, at least so far. Seems good.
So far. Well, tell us a little bit about your journey so that our listeners get to know about who you are and how you got to be writing this book. I think that would be always very interesting.
Sure. Well, I often say what a long, strange trip it's been. I started out in consulting for a big consulting firm when I got out of business school, then spent a few years in the CPG world. But really, since 1991, I've worked almost exclusively in retail. So I joined Sears Roebuck and Company, which many of your listeners might know was at one point the most valuable, biggest retailer on the planet, and now basically doesn't exist, which ties a little bit to what the book is about. And then I moved down to Dallas, where I live now, to be the head of strategy and some other things for the Neiman Marcus group. So I had about, whatever that adds up to be, 13, 14 years or 15, 16 years on the corporate leadership side, mostly working on strategy, but also some other kind of functional things and running a division, and good mix of stuff. And then about 15 years ago, I went out on my own as a strategy consultant. And then I've just kind of added to my portfolio over the last few years, started writing for Forbes and on my own blog. That led to some keynote speaking. We were talking off mic about how you started with this program during COVID. Same thing for me in the Remarkable Retail podcast. That was a COVID project. So I've gotten on some boards. So the through line on most of my stuff has been definitely retail, kind of on the leading edge of digital disruption. But I've definitely been interested in why companies struggle to transform, struggle to adapt to a new age. As I said, with my Sears experience, that's a really obvious one, but I see that across the board, not just in retail, but in many other industries as well.
Yeah, and this is actually something I'm working on as part of a new book project that I'm pursuing. And the statistics are really interesting. If you look just not at the exceptions, but if you look broadly at most firms, the median age at which a firm grows to has been studied by places like Deloitte and KPMG. And the conclusion is that the average large firm lasts 40 to 50 years, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And I think you're getting at something that's a very fundamental phenomenon. And, there are people who say that's not a big deal, out with the old, in with the new. And
right.
My perspective, I think, is a little different, which is like these firms take so much with them when they implode. I grew up in Rochester, so intimately familiar with the Kodak story.
Sure.
Of course, with this story. And I think there's just something deeper going on here than just bad management. And I think that's one of the interesting things I took away from your book. So you open it up with your description of this fantastic strategy thing that you just gotten the board to approve, and you're going to turn Sears around, and it's going to be awesome. And then you concluded about that strategy. It's not a strategy to win. just suck less.
Yeah, it's not the most. Well, I blame that on a guy who worked for me, but it is true. Yeah, I think part of the reason why I tell that story is a little bit actually what I talk about on my first book, Remarkable Retail, is that even very good is no longer good enough. And I think what we often see, not just in the last few years, but going back for a long period of time, where companies basically innovate to parity. They think they're doing something that's really great, but in essence, it is either kind of table stakes for the business, or that it's become table stakes. So by the time you do all this effort and you get to this new place, well, the world has moved on and you're behind again. And that was very much the case in Sears. I mean, Sears is kind of a complicated story and probably not super interesting to go into in detail, but actually the same guy that I talk about saying our strategy wasn't a strategy to win, it was a strategy to suck less. John often said, Sears Sears got 11 of the 10 most important trends wrong. So there's a lot of mistakes along the way. But fundamentally, we had gotten so far behind that what it would possibly take, even just to kind of get back to status quo, was a lot. And then flash forward, because that was 2002, 2003, so quite a while ago, and it wasn't really so much about e-commerce at that point. It was more about competitors like Home Depot and Lowe's and Best Buy. But now when we see this world of abundant choice, abundant information, largely frictionless commerce, all these kind of buzzwords, you get to a point where it's just harder and harder to keep pace. And then once you get behind, it may be next to impossible to catch up.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I've always thought it was supremely ironic that if you think about it, I mean, Sears really was the first direct-to-consumer company like on the planet. Mm-hmm. Back in the days when things were still being delivered by horse and wagon,
Right, exactly.
And that company was so perfectly set up to do just that, and then somehow lost the plot. It's just fascinating to me. And it gets me to another observation, which I would make about established firms, which is a thing called a competence trap. And the basic is that, you take anything, call it Excel spreadsheets or something, right? And when it gets presented to you, it's just a plain vanilla box of stuff. And then to add value to it, what you do is you embed it, you fill it with knowledge, you create your own macros, you do all this stuff that adds a lot of value to that thing. And then someone comes along and says, hey, you've been using Excel, like you go up here and use zap function, right? You can improve your performance by this much. But before you get there, you've now got to undergo the suffering of losing, that idiosyncratic advantage that you build up from doing the first thing. And I think that's a real thread that I see in a lot of these stories of companies that just don't get there. And so talk a little bit about this concept of remarkable, because I think people don't understand the difference between just as good as and truly great.
Right. Well, so I use it in the way that some folks listening might be familiar with Seth Godin's book, Purple Cow, from, I guess, close to 20 years ago now, where he talked about remarkable as being probably the more commonplace way we think about it, which is unique, highly differentiated, special, those kinds of things. But he also meant that people literally would talk about what you're doing, that it's so distinctive and sort of so emotional connecting, I guess, is one way you could think about it, that people will spread the story of your brand. And so that's better than just having a unique selling proposition, right? It's something that really propels your brand forward and takes it to a whole new level. So what I try to get at with Remarkable Retail, and I reprise a bit in this book, is this idea that if you're going to win in this environment where there's so much choice, there's so much competition, you really have to aim even higher on the value you're delivering to customers, because you may not even get noticed if you don't do that, much less get the engagement, get the sale, get the loyalty, get the NPS scores, whatever might be those metrics. So fundamentally thinking that a slightly better version of what you've already done is likely to be successful over the long term, you're probably kidding yourself. I can't say that about every industry, but I think a lot of the big industries, that's very true. So this idea of aiming higher, really exceptional customer value, really distancing yourself from your best competition, I think has become ever more important as the choices have expanded, basically, and as largely this is driven by e-commerce. So that's one of the main concepts, was this idea of aiming higher, and then the kind of related concept to this is also moving faster, because yes, you may create that remarkable experience, but with technology changes, consumer changes, competitive changes, whatever it might be, it's pretty hard to hold on to that advantage for very long in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, if you think about the 2010s, right? We had all this buzz about the direct-to-consumer business and everything, retail, conventional retail was going to go away, and everything was going to be delivered doorstep. And if you were a millennial, you never had to put real clothes on; you could just live in your pajamas.
Right.
And it was all going to be Dollar Shave Club and Harry's and, and what is it? Just last year, I started to see headlines about the direct-to-consumer phase crashes to earth, amidst.
Right. Yeah.
It's just another.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in my first book, because I'm sure many folks will remember the first kind of .com bust And then I was kind of like, well, there's not that it's .com per se, but it's more these direct to consumer digitally native vertical brand models that, we had pets.com of, 20 years ago. And now we're having kind of the next iteration of pets.com where some of these high flying businesses have crashed back down to earth in terms of their valuations, or in some cases have gotten gobbled up by a bigger conglomerate or even gone out of business. So, I think it's hard. One of the things I talk about a little bit in the book is really, I don't call it exactly this, but it's to develop the capacity for discernment, because there are a lot of unreliable narrators that we face, whether somebody's just, it's an investor that's trying to put forward a certain narrative, or the media, we become a very, pay-per-click sort of world. And, I'm guilty of trying to write headlines that are going to get attention as well. So we all understand how it is. So it's a lot more interesting to say there's a retail apocalypse than to have a more nuanced, story or headline, or, every mall is going away, or, these kinds of things have become pretty popular in the, kind of general zeitgeist of the business world. But in many cases, they're not true, or the implication that anybody's really going to pay attention to is not very helpful, because it's just a very general statement and it's not true in specifics.
Right. Well, I'm reminded of the co-CEO, co-founder of Harry's, saying it's never been cheaper to start a business, and it's never been hard, which I thought to prevent others from just copying what you do. So I'd be curious what your take is on the current state of, digitally distributed platform-based advertising, because I think we're looking at a bubble.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know, to a certain degree, and this is maybe not a smart thing to say, is like I'm really careful about not making, or trying not to make too many predictions, because I feel like it's just harder and harder to predict the future. I used to think I had a pretty good workable crystal ball, and I certainly have been out there saying that I thought the metaverse was overhyped, and things like that, which has turned out to be largely true. But I think, we go through, what is it, the Gartner hype cycle, and we get very, very excited about certain things, and all this money runs to it. And in many cases, valuations get inflated, and then reality starts to set in. And to your earlier point, it's now so easy for people to throw up all sorts of businesses. If it's a digitally driven business, doesn't require a massive investment in computers or physical buildings or whatever, suddenly you're in business. And then suddenly there's thousands of competitors. So I think we're in a little bit of a hype cycle on quite a few things. Maybe AI is the only thing that, like I heard somebody say, AI is overhyped in the short term, but underhyped in the long term. So that's the one thing where I think the hype is mostly true. Everything else, I have to say, I have a healthy skepticism towards.
In fact,
which is maybe not the most nuanced, educated view, but.
Oh no, I'm fascinated by it. I just was on a call with a professor at Princeton, actually, who's taking a very different take at AI, and from his perspective, which I think is fascinating, he said the problem with commercial scale use of a lot of our AI models is it's impossible to figure out why it made the recommendation or spit out the output. And so you had
which is
ability.
scary.
Yeah, which means, you got to be really like, I don't want it running my cardiac surgery hospital, right?
Right.
You probably don't want to do that. Anyway, so back to the book. So you've got these, you call them seven leadership mind leaps. And I think your phrase there is quite distinctive, because you're talking about really a phase change in sort of the way we did it at one point, and now you're proposing that people do it.
Right.
I was appreciating that sort of toward the end of the book, you start talking about courage. And I'd love to spend some time with your take on that, because making a leap, that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, so maybe just a tiny bit of quick context on the idea of leaps. I'm sure most people sort of get the basic concept, but I kind of deal with these leaps, and to your point, all of them kind of tie back to courage to a certain degree. I talk about this need at the business strategy level to often take a leap, that this incremental, slow, steady kind of change just really doesn't work in a lot of cases. Now, that doesn't mean to be reckless or do moonshots or those kinds of things, but there's kind of this strategic overall leap to make. And that's that idea of aiming higher, moving faster, kind of boldly moving to a different place. But when I get to the question of, well, and actually this is something I very much learned at Sears and have learned with clients and just observing the industry, it's often the case that leaders know they need to change. They may often have a pretty good idea of what they need to do, but we see time and time again that they don't do it. And I kind of come back to this question, even though I don't pose it this way exactly in the book. If the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? And the you is sometimes you, the brand, you, the organization, you, the culture. But in a lot of cases, I actually absolutely mean the leader themselves. So I started to think about, well, there's plenty of good books. Innovator's Dilemma, Blue Ocean Strategy. There's lots of books on transformation and how to find new white space, or all sorts of different ways that's been phrased. But it's not often through lack of knowledge that we don't act. So what I try to do with these mind leaps is say, okay, let's look at some of the ways we get stuck as leaders, which ultimately keep our organizations stuck. And the idea of the mind leaps were really to try to change your mindset and to go from one way of being in the world or being a leader in an organization to a meaningfully different way of being and leading. And to your point, many of them do lead back to courage. I do specifically talk about safe being risky in one of the chapters. But I think when it comes to something you were talking about earlier, kind of letting go of our hammer that's really good at pounding a particular set of nails, realizing or accepting that what's made us successful in the past may not at all make us successful going forward. In fact, if we don't let go of that mindset, it may actually get in the way of us taking the action that we need to do. Letting go of kind of old ideas of leadership, of kind of top down command and control, admitting that we need help, some of these things that I think have become tired ways of leading. But also it's having the courage to redefine your business model. I feel like old is new again, because when I was in business school way back in the 80s, we would talk about, what business are you in? Are you really in the X business? You're in the Y business. So it's kind of a cliche to talk about that. And I think it's a valuable idea. What I think is different over the last few years is when we get into this kind of boundaryless world where particularly, digitally, you can marry supply and demand together in ways you couldn't. So obviously Uber, Airbnb, there's been a bunch of business models that have reconfigured the traditional way of doing something because technology enables, things to be bundled or pieced together in different ways. So I think it actually gets back to, before we started, we were talking about Clayton Christensen, thinking about, do you have the courage to look at your business, not I'm in the department store business, I'm in the taxi business, I'm in the hotel business, but what customer job am I trying to get done? What solution, end state, or however you want to describe it, am I trying to get to? And can I use technology, typically, to make that happen? But often that requires me to let go of the way I've done things. And in some cases, it basically mothballs some of your investments. So I think there's different aspects of courage. There's the courage to say I'm wrong. There's the courage to say these skills that have made me so successful, maybe I've got to develop some new skills. There's the courage to ask for help. There's the courage to give up on a business model that's running out of steam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I was really trying to get both at some strategy points that are important and different by virtue of how things are evolving, but also really kind of look the leader and look myself in the eye and say, okay, how does our ego get in the way? How does our unwillingness to open the aperture for other possibilities? How willing are we to kind of blow up what we've been doing and rebuild something perhaps quite a bit different? And are we willing to move faster, take more risk, fundamentally recognizing that slow and steady could actually turn out to be the most damning thing you could do to your organization and yourself?
So one of our frequent listeners, Bogdan, asks, is the answer on the side of corporate governance and power, or not only to look to strategy and innovations?
Well, that's an excellent question. And one of the things, we actually edited this out of the book because there was this kind of whole side track I went on as to what are other things that keep change from happening, because you definitely have governance issues, you have investor issues. Some companies, like I'll just give a real life example. When I was at Sears, we looked at actually quite a very big range of ways of reinvigorating the business, including things that were quite radical. And we ultimately decided not to pursue the most radical path because we didn't really think it was going to work. But we had a whole conversation of, even if we became convinced that going after the most radical rebuilding was theoretically the smart thing, there was no way our board was going to approve it. Or even if the board approved it, Wall Street wouldn't tolerate it, because we didn't have the credibility to say, give us billions of dollars and a bunch of years, and yeah, it's going to be rough for a while, but trust us, at the other end, we're going to be, Amazon, and Walmart combined, right? So there are lots of issues, I think, around governance, culture, ownership structure, maybe regulation in some cases that are also considerations, or barriers for certain organizations to do what they might want to do, or even get the leader to get behind. So I think all these things are important. What I was really trying to do with the book, and we'll see if it's ultimately successful in this regard, was to be less prescriptive and sort of more inspirational. Because, well, first of all, it's just hard to write a book. I think I'm sure you can relate to this. Like, you think of all the possible situations, you're trying to have resonance, you got to be specific, but you also can't get too specific or allow other people to out. So it's hard to kind of hit that right stride, I think. But mostly what I wanted to get people to do is really take a look in the mirror and see how ego gets in the way, how their ignorance gets in the way, et cetera. And then what I do at the end of these 7 mind leap chapters is pose some questions, which I hope helps the reader or a group of people on the leadership team try to translate this more to their specific situation. But yeah, there's a lot of, change is complicated, at the risk of stating the obvious.
Yeah. So for those of you that might just be joining us, my guest this week is Steve Dennis. He's written this great book called Leaders Leap, which is basically a shorthand guide to how, as a leader, you can perhaps prevent your company from going the way of all things and lurching into obsolescence. So the first chapter that you talk about is crush your ego, ask for help. And it was interesting to me that you led with that. Tom Peters for many talked about how kind of ego, specifically ego among men, is one of the biggest barriers to change happening in the world. And I thought it was interesting you chose to lead with that.
Well, yes, I'm aware of Tom's work on that and others. I guess my philosophy here was, I probably come at it from 2 approaches. One was, I think, this idea that, as a leader, you got to, kind of put your own mask on first. Like, if you're not in a position to lead the change, if you don't understand how you can accelerate or detract from what's going to happen, some of the other downstream stuff, it's not necessarily relevant, but it just makes it harder to get momentum. So I felt like some of these ego principles, they're very foundational to much of what I was going to say next. So that felt like a good place to start. But I also have my own personal experience where my ego was my own worst enemy. And when I look back at some of the struggles I had really 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't, it's not to say I always had the right answer or that I was always highly skilled in what I was doing. But when I can point, or when I do point to things that did not go well, it usually was a problem that I had with my ego, not asking for help, thinking that I was kind of the sole repository of all information and insight. And I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point, but not too much. And it's funny, it was another thing we pulled back a little bit on the book, but I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot of the characteristics of male behavior, mansplaining, a lot of reinforcing cultural things. And, I think that our society generally, not to get into a big tangent here, but, I think I was taught that, as a man, sort of protector, like all these sort of stereotypical kinds of behaviors and, kind of type A personality, not that there aren't I mean, this is obviously not purely a gendered issue, but I do think there is that sort of stereotypical behavior, but it's stereotypical because there's a lot of evidence. And there's a lot of, I think in a lot of cultures, including ones that I work with today, there's a lot of self-reinforcing things. So I think if we're going to really be more vulnerable, because that's one of the things I talk about in that chapter, and more humble, then, and again, women can have these same issues, but I think there is a kind of corporate style that's sort of male dominated or male trait dominated. That's not very helpful for the way we need to lead. Not to mention, it's just very irritating and aggravating to a lot of people. And so, yeah, well, I've done some personal apologizing, but I do mention that I was guilty of more mansplaining than probably anybody should be subjected to. And, it's taken me a little while to go back and realize, like, yeah, I was kind of a jerk.
Well, one book that I was asked to write a foreword for, and I declined. And when I tell you the title, you'll know why. The book was called "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" And I thought, but it's by a really good friend of mine, Thomas Chamorro from music.
Yeah, it's a good title in a way.
And what he argues, and I think this is where a lot of guys get trapped, is he argues that we as a species tend to promote confidence and not realize it's a separate trait from competence. And that one of the examples he uses is Angela Merkel, right? So she gets up in the morning, she has her cup of coffee, she reads the paper, she gets on with business, she goes to the office, she has productive meetings all day long, she comes home, maybe she has a glass of wine and she goes to bed. What is even remotely interesting about that? Right. And so the sort of quietly competent people sometimes get overlooked when we're thinking about what makes a great leader.
Oh, sure. And I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that in many cases we're fighting, kind of evolutionary biology. Part of what I talk about in this idea of really dealing with your fear is, we're just wired through evolution to be afraid that we're going to get eaten by a bear or whatever. Like that's just part of what's wired into it. And so it's not good or bad, but realizing that most human beings are not that great at assessing risk. Many, you have your adrenaline junkies and others, so there's exceptions. But for the most part, the reason we're afraid of speaking, the reason why we're afraid of, heights, whatever, there's all sorts of things that are somewhat irrational, yet they're very real in the moment. And so I think that admitting that is or certain biases, why is it that American presidents have tended to all be very, very tall, right? Like it doesn't have anything to do with whether they would be good leaders, but there's something apparently about the way we see competence that's also related to height or wide shoulders, right? So there's these things, and I think if we're going to get past our subconscious bias or whatever it might be, and really, sort of intentionally go after some opportunities, we often have to accept the reality of that, whether it's uncomfortable or not, and work against our kind of base instincts or reflexive kind of thing. So I think that's just to me a part of being, mindful and intentional about what we're doing. But I think as getting back to the ego point, I think that, causes us to go, well, wait a minute, maybe I need to look at where I'm not showing up in the way I want to, or where I do have biases. One of the books I quote or talk about some of Adam Grant's work on the need to rethink and almost like wipe our brains clean sometimes and start fresh, or at least be aware of our biases or just habits we've fallen into that get in the way. And I think that's not completely new news, nor are some of the other things I talk about. But I think the point I'm trying to make is you maybe could sort of get away with that when you were just competing with the guy across the street instead of the whole world. And maybe you could get away with that when we weren't subject to Moore's law, or, just things like AI that can have the power to transform the way we do business in very profound ways. And so, really letting go of the things that are holding you back has never been more important, I would argue. And really being able to accelerate your journey, whatever that looks like, is also essential, because the world is just moving fast and it demands a higher level of performance.
Yeah. And so the second chapter, which I guess builds on this very nicely, you call Wake Up.
Yeah.
Uh,
We had a different, a little less polite title in the first draft.
do tell.
Um, it had an F in there. Um, but my publisher convinced me. Maybe that wasn't necessary.
Well, my
But
dear friend, just to convince you of the rightness of that. So my dear friend Bob Sutton wrote a book years ago called The No Asshole Rule. And from now on,
yeah,
he's the asshole guy everywhere he goes.
well, yeah, there is a problem, and it's been a little bit overdone probably too. But no, I feel like, well, so the uh, I present this in a little bit more measured way, I think. But what I have seen, and it gets back to kind of what I said earlier about if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? Particularly spending all this time in retail. For example, which I think most people, even if they aren't in retail, they can relate to. If you look at the department stores, most department stores, Macy's, JCPenney, et cetera, have been losing, well, as a category, they've been losing market share for more than 20 years. The business is about a quarter of the size it was when I left Sears in total. Macy's and others have been closing stores. They've had very, I would say, best case scenario, lackluster performance. That's fairly charitable. And so, what have leaders been paying attention to at those businesses? Have they, I mean, again, there's a little bit of like, surely this, right? But what other knowledge do you need? What realities or emerging realities do you have to wake up to and accept and sort out to take action? So I think in some cases, it gets back to this idea of, letting go of things that have served you. You may need to look at different data. You may need to say, what, maybe what's going to change my industry is actually not coming from within the industry. It's coming from outside of the industry, because to a certain degree, in a digital world where we're doing so much on our phones, like I'm not necessarily making a big distinction between shopping for shoes, booking a train ride, or any number in my next vacation or whatever, because it's all a battle for attention centered on my smart device, right? So I'm not making these distinctions of like, now I'm in a car dealership, now I'm in a hotel, now I'm in a restaurant, right? It's not the same point of comparison. So you have to rethink, I think, a lot of the way we go about things. So I talk about, being willing to challenge the perimeter of your ignorance, like where are you really and where do you need to get to in terms of your understanding of what's going on? And it's probably outside your domain. There's also this concept, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, beginner's mind. Where do you need to, it's this unlearning kind of thing that Adam Grant talks about. So I say wake up, to be a little bit provocative, like a little bit of a whack in the head. Like when I originally put this together, I really felt like I was speaking to these people that have been sleepwalking through the revolution, as I talk about, like, come on, like, how do you not see this? But I think the more positive side of it, because this book isn't just about, keeping yourself from going bankrupt. It's also, how can you use these ideas to propel you forward? You might be in a good position. So this is not just for people like at the edge of the precipice that are about to fall in. This is also for people to understand that maybe their pace right now needs to be picked up, and maybe they can take advantage of opportunities as well. So the more you understand, the more you kind of break through your denial, the more you unlearn stuff and learn new things. I think that positions you to take the leaps you need to.
Interesting. I one of my academic colleagues, a man named Bill Andrew, he says, the reason people don't want innovation in them, they could do it if they wanted to, but they don't, because it's the thing that pays for second homes and expensive educations, and nobody wants to upset the apple cart. And I thought that was very astute in terms of the center of gravity that you find at so many of these big firms, and yet
Sure.
that's not very helpful when you're thinking about the future. So then
Right.
were you talking about special, not big? And then who are you
Right.
serving? That was really
Yeah.
strategic point of view. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. So this is one of the points where I do hopefully add a little bit of a twist to some strategic thinking. So it's a little less about kind of personal characteristics, a little bit more about how to think about your strategy. So the idea of special, not big, is really narrowing your aim. You're trying to say, well, one of the points I make is, I believe generally that the era of massification, if that's even a word, is largely over, that the battle among the big super scale low cost players is largely over. So I'm not suggesting Walmart's going away or anything like that, but I think for most of us, the idea that we're going to out Amazon or out Walmart, like the scale and scope, and you look at the kind of investments that Microsoft and OpenAI and just the whole technology infrastructure, companies can obviously work with AWS to support their cloud computing, right? But to try to compete on that basis just becomes such a game of scale and scope and cost advantage. So I think for most of us, as we look for opportunities to grow, it's actually, I think, better in most cases to say, I'm not going to engage in a race to the bottom. I'm going to engage in a race to the top and narrow my focus and become more meaningful for a subset of customers. So again, I'll go back to the department store example. There was a fork in the road probably 20 years ago for a Macy's. They could try to go lower cost and get into that game, and I'm sure that would have been wildly unsuccessful. But they also could have said, well, having a bunch of stuff in a 2-level store is just, kind of like a fancy warehouse, right? If it's just a bunch of stuff, the internet's pretty good at that, as well as there are plenty of other players that are either cheaper than we are or more special than we are. So you've got to pick this lane. And I think for many businesses that were based on a little bit of everything for everybody, we've seen the Toys R Us's largely go out of business, the Bed Bath and Beyonds go out of business. So how do you narrow your aim, become more meaningful to a smaller set of people? And this is not a new idea in terms of what boutique hotels do, but I think it's becoming more and more important, because being stuck in this, kind of undifferentiated middle is clearly causing a lot of folks to either go out of business or struggle mightily. So special, not big is figuring out who it's really for in a very specific way, narrowing that aim, going deeper, maybe editing. This term I've stolen from Nike, which is called edit to amplify. So how do I shrink down what I do so that the special things I do really are elevated, and that the people that care about what I do, which is saying no to a lot of other people or not so interested in you, that's the way you stand out. And I think we're just going to see more and more of that. It helps simplify your business. It helps customers understand, is this brand for me or not? And I think it's very much okay to say, you know what, maybe this isn't for you. That's fine. We're going to really focus on the people that we can win with in a really powerful way, build that loyalty, build that remarkability. And that's kind of the self-propelling flywheel, I guess, for lack of a better term.
What you're making me think of is the competition between a brand like Revlon and Ulta Beauty.
Mm-hmm.
But the Ulta Beauty shopper, I mean, they know who they are, and they serve them really, really well. And their growth has been phenomenal, even in an era when everybody's proclaiming the death of all retail. Ulta's just selling it, which I think is very.
Well, it also, as a practical matter, I mean, this gets a little bit confusing because of the vastness of the internet, where, in theory, you have the so-called endless aisle, right? But what I think is so powerful, so one of the examples I use is a company I've worked with called Tractor Supply, and they have relatively small stores. They're very focused geographically in rural and kind of ex-urban, I guess we'd call them, markets, because their target customer are farmers, ranchers, and kind of gentleman farmers and people that might have some chickens or things like that. So it's kind of a superstore just for those sort of customers. And so even though they carry a lot of stuff that a Home Depot does, they carry a lot of stuff that a Pet Supply, Petco might, and so there's no one category that they're in where it's really unique, but they put it all together in one place. And you really get the sense that for somebody like me, this is the store that really gets me. If I got to go to Home Depot, yeah, I could find some of that stuff, but I can't find the other stuff I need. And I got to go through this huge store and go down the aisle, and they've just got that one section. And so I think it's just very clever editing. Again, it's really no different than any kind of specialty store, specialty hotel, great restaurant, whatever. But I think to be able to be the signal amid all the noise and all the distraction that we have in the world, it makes so much more sense to try to narrow down what you do and then kind of boost that signal, because that's what breaks through the clutter, that helps you get customers that have, it's kind of the tribal people like us do things like this idea that also makes it easier to target your marketing. It makes it easy for the word of mouth to develop because it's pretty clear, like you're either a Tractor Supply customer or you're not. You're either an Hermes customer or you're not. It's very, not that it isn't a little bit of black and white or a little gray in there, but so I don't want to make it overly black and white. But I think when my experience, and I think research shows that the brands that we have the tightest relationship with or feel like we really belong as part of that tribe, it's usually pretty clear. And it's also very clear, like, that's not for me. And that's fine if you can make the economics work for you as a business.
I'm reminded of Kraft Heinz, which of course has been through this absolute roller coaster with some of its brands. And in one of its most recent efforts to kind of reincarnate itself around the people love, they went out and found all these examples, which they put together in a video vignette of people who are just loving the Kraft brands to the point where they're getting them tattooed on their bodies.
Yeah.
The brand statement. Okay.
That's a sign, right? Yeah, that's what they used to say about Harley Davidson, right? Like, you've got real brand fans when they put a tattoo on.
And that kind of brings us to chapter 4, which is start with wow, right? And who the wow is for and what would be a wow experience and why.
Yeah, so this is very much related to special, not big. So I think of these chapters, there's the narrow your aim, and then there's the boost the signal kind of part. And so again, it gets a little bit back to what I was saying earlier about the need to be remarkable, which is in a very noisy world, battle for attention, so many messages coming at us, distraction, you name it. How do you find those 1, 2, 3 things that are really, really special? So that could be product, it could be service, it could be environment. I mean, there's lots of things that could make that. But I think what I see is too many companies, they start with what they do today, and then they do what I call the slightly better version of mediocre or faster horse kind of strategy. Like, I assume this is what I'm doing. Here are my features and benefits, or here's my value proposition, however you want to think about it. And I'm just going to kind of dial up a little bit, make these incremental improvements. I just think it's so hard to win, when you've got so many competitors, loyalty's afraid, in a lot of cases, I can say, oh, gee, I wonder if I want this from this provider or another provider. I can get on the web and do this in a matter of seconds. Like, I can go through a whole shopping journey very, very quickly. So if there's not anything powerful to really draw me into the brand and ultimately get the sales, cement the loyalty, create that high net promoter score, or however you want to think about it, you just risk being lost. And so I think trying to figure out what those wow factors are, and by wow, I mean, clearly distinctive, but I also think, particularly for a more premium kind of experience, you have to create that emotional connection. Like, it's not the best brands, I would argue. And if you just look at retail, the most valuable brands are Apple, LVMH. I mean, these are brands that are premium in a lot of regard, have enormous margins. And it's not so much because of a feature and benefit. Like, you get in these arguments about whether the Android's better than the Apple. And I'm always like, who cares? You're an Apple person or you're an Android person, right? It's because you're emotionally connected to the brand. I worked at Neiman Marcus. We sold lots of stuff. In fact, there's a joke about Stanley Marcus, the founding family, where somebody came, I tell this in my first book, where somebody came into the store, got a big tour, and at the end, the guy said, I've never seen so much stuff that nobody needs all in one place. And, it's like, yeah, I mean, because nobody needs a $3,000 handbag, right? And you could get into a big discussion as to why that bag costs $3,000 versus a bag that costs $100, $50, whatever. And yes, there are differences in the materials and the fabrication and all that kind of stuff. But the big difference, and of course, cosmetics is a great example of this, it's how it makes you feel, right? And that's fine. Like, I think, again, that's a little bit of, you don't have to judge it based upon whether that's a healthy thing for the world, like that's a whole other thing. But that's the way, we want, as creatures, want to belong. We want this sense of belonging as well as differentiation, kind of all at the same time. And the best brands sort of draw you in, because I'm an Apple person or I'm a Louis Vuitton person or what have you, Hermes. But at the same time, I want you maybe to notice me because like I'm with this group, I'm not with this group. And so I think that's just what great brands do. So what is that? What is that wow factor? It may be an emotion you create. And, how do you put that all together through environment, through messaging, through product, of course, service, perhaps, et cetera. So again, I just think that these ideas aren't fundamentally new. It's just that what it takes to really distinguish yourself on this basis has gotten harder and become more important.
Yeah, I'm reminded with you bringing up Apple. Right now, they're embroiled in a bit of controversy because the ad for their latest iPad
right.
shows this industrial crusher basically crushing like beautiful guitars and trombones and just crushing things. And there's just been this kind of collective rage from the creator community saying, what is the message that you are sending? These beautiful objects should be replaced by this thing. And I thought it was so interesting that under the current regime, that's the way they look at these things, because Steve Jobs back in the day was very big on the physicality of things.
Right.
That's why he introduced the script the way it was introduced, and those kinds of things. So I think it's kind of interesting to see the brand decisions that are being made, and what's really driving them. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think we recorded an episode of my podcast, Remarkable Retail Podcast, this morning, and we were talking about this, and I think well, first of all, it's an example of where when I talk about remarkable, that was very remarkable, but not in a good way, right? Like ideally, you're doing things that propel you forward and get people talking, but not necessarily in a negative way, right? But I also think it says a lot about the identification with the brand, right? Because so many people that were presumably interested and loyal to Apple had such a visceral reaction. So I think if not to pick on Macy's anymore, but a brand that's more anodyne, they could do something and it just wouldn't even get much of a reaction, or not at the level that it does with Apple. But it's kind of like, we trusted you. We thought you were better than this. Are you just doing this to be different? Is it a think different kind of thing, but taken to the extreme and you've gotten tunnel vision or something? So I don't know if that's a good example of where ego has gotten in the way and allowed them or prevented them from seeing things clearly or what, but
well, and then
obviously it's become a bit of a fiasco.
Well, yeah, and then the tagline is, "Oh, well, it's thinner." Well, the difference between 6 millimeters and 5 millimeters, like to an ordinary person, that's not very consequential thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it makes a difference if you decide to take your iPad on that next business trip or not, but for most of the use cases, to have all that, that sort of destruction lead up to, and now it's thinner. It's just like.
Yes. Yeah, I think we call that a bad payoff in the end.
Yeah. Anyway, so the next chapter, Think Radically, which is an example of where somebody did do that, but sometimes radical is not necessarily the best course of action.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the labeling of the chapter, what I'm trying to get at is that you often do have to destroy things to create the level or enable the level of creation that you need. So there is an aspect, which is maybe unfortunate given what we just talked about with Apple, of blowing things up to be able to reconfigure things in a fundamental way. But what I'm trying to get people to look at is can you find opportunities or fix a problem in your business by starting with kind of a blank canvas strategy? And but actually, so I've working with a client now where I said, well, here, let's play a little exercise. Let's start from scratch. We have a sense of who the consumers are. We have a sense of what the opportunity looks like. But let's make believe we don't have these stores. We don't have these things. But if there are any of these assets or capabilities that we want to bring into this new venture, we get to bring them. But it's a decision to bring the real estate or bring in the capabilities or trademarks, whatever it might be, into this new thing. And I think it can be a very liberating exercise. Now, as a practical matter, you're not going to just go from this state to the other state, in a year. But if you think about, at least in the hotel world, or something that's, retail, something that's largely based in physical assets, it does start to think about, like, Sears would have been much better had we invested more aggressively in concepts that were not tied to regional malls and that didn't have a particular configuration, as would Macy's, as would JCPenney. It just hasn't happened. So I think there's something about starting with a blank sheet, thinking about how you can reconfigure the assets and capability. Well, I'm using assets loosely, I guess, in this case. So it's like, what liabilities could we be free of? What assets could we position in maybe a radically different way? What new things could we add to create a very different kind of business model over time? So I think that does require you to be willing to let go of stuff. It requires you to understand what other possibilities are out there, and fundamentally start to take some different kinds of risks.
Well, and one of the exercises I do along these lines is, I call it brand takeover, which is, let's say your company just got taken over by Nike. What would they want you to? What would they want you to do? If they increased your marketing budget by 10x, what would you do? And I find just getting out of the frame of reference of your own firm is very liberating.
Yeah, I don't like that. I like that. The other one I've done a lot is really, which is just, kind of the disrupt yourself kind of idea. But, if you wanted to, if a bunch of you were going to leave and try to take away the sector of the business that's responsible for, say, just 10% of your profits, or the 5% of your revenue, but disproportionately profitable. If you're going to create a business just to go after that, what would you do? And of course, that's what we end up seeing with a lot of disruptor brands, is they don't necessarily go after, Warby Parker is not going after the entire optical business, right? They're people with this sort of attitude who are willing to be digitally led, that are, and so that's allowed them to peel off whatever it's going to be, probably close to $1 billion in business from the incumbents, because they didn't go after the whole thing. They went after a piece of it.
Yeah, I like that. And I think one of the most important chapters really is the one on safe being risky. I just resonated so much with that, because so much of what I hear when I work with companies, my area is innovation and strategy. So, so I say to people, what's your innovation governance function? And they look at me like called out from under a rock. And I think what's wrong says, this is risky, it might fail, I don't know for sure what the outcome is, and I can't put the ROI in a spreadsheet, so I'm just not going to do it.
Well, I think, there's a lot here, probably we talk about this for hours, but I think fundamentally, well, first of all, you have to really, what I advise, and a lot of times I'll start with companies, I'll say, tell me about the culture here. Is the culture wired to say yes, or is it wired to say no? Do you have your foot on the gas pedal or your foot on the brakes? And a lot of people, a lot of times it's very easy for them to answer the question. They just don't like the answer because they know what I'm getting at. But I think, there's a defense of the status quo that is very prevalent in particularly large organizations. But I think, not only what I said earlier, just we have to accept that we're not really wired to take much risk generally, and accept that, but also see risk in a different way. And it's kind of, this is not a great visual, but there's a lot of slow, painful deaths that are going on the part of many companies, right? And so, if I feel like I'm picking on Macy's, but if I'm at Macy's, like, I don't have to get to work every day and revolutionize the company, right? But every day that I don't do something or start moving towards something bolder, that's going to be fundamentally better for the customer and differentiate me from the competition, I'm closer to death. So, but in the moment, it seems pretty scary to do some of those kinds of things. So I think we have to understand that the status quo, or even slow and steady, is often the riskiest strategy we can sign up for. But then we have to figure out ways to not make it sound like I've got to figure out everything that's totally, very complicated and is going to take forever today. That's not the way it works. You have to figure out a path. And so in many cases, that's about, test and learn culture. It's about having a budget for more exploratory things that don't have the same kind of ROI criteria or don't neatly fit into a budget cycle. It's about having gating process. So there's a lot around, and I try not to get too into, because there's plenty of good books and and TED Talks and whatnot, talking about how to improve the innovation process. So I think those are excellent. But I do think fundamentally the mindset shift is safe is risky. And so what am I doing to understand, make more tangible the risk of inaction or the risk of incremental or slow change versus something more bold? Again, not Hail Mary, moonshot, like it's not about being reckless, but it is about changing. And the subtitle of the book, I should have mentioned earlier, this idea of transforming at the speed of disruption. For every company, the speed of disruption, thank you, the speed of disruption is going to be different. I keep saying that. I think for my dry cleaner down the street, my guess is speed of disruption in that business pretty slow. Now, maybe, I don't know, they're going to have robots or AI or whatever that's going to revolutionize that business. But I think you can,
during the pandemic, talk to dry cleaners during the pandemic.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I think, there are going to be there are going to be sectors of the industry that are moving extremely quickly, where if you're not keeping pace, then you are falling behind. I mean, that's the thing I think that really you have to understand is what's really happening to your business. How fast are things changing? Why? And are you really fundamentally addressing the reasons you're losing relevance, market share, profitability, whatever it might be, and be willing to take those bold steps to minimally keep pace, because otherwise you are going to be irrelevant and perhaps extinct. But ideally, to be able to leapfrog, if you are behind, to be able to leapfrog the competition a bit and actually build advantage. But again, I think with the pace of change accelerating generally, often more exponential than linear, and customer demands being elevated and new competition coming into play, which, may or may not be funded the same way. Like it is annoying when venture capital firms, where people are willing to invest a bunch of money and lose money for a long period of time, and you've got to compete with them. I mean, that is a real nuisance in some cases, more than a nuisance. So, but yeah, understand the speed of disruption, how that translates to the degree of risk you need to sign up for, and then how do you intelligently manage that risk so it is not just a reckless Hail Mary, big bet.
Absolutely. I mean, it drives me so crazy when people overinvest in these, flashy Hail Mary things and just underinvest in the slow, steady progress that eventually leads to really radical growth. So before we close, but this was fun. I wanted to pull up some of my favorite quotes from the book.
Okay.
So the first one I actually wrote down was that you wanted to be on deck to be the first keynote speaker at the Antarctic Retail Expo. I love that. That was great.
Well, the context for that is I have spoken on 6 continents, and there are 7 continents, I believe. So we'll see, but I'm not holding my breath for that particular keynote.
Getting the audience there is a bit of a challenge. Stop trying to seduce the promiscuous shopper. I thought that was fun. Mm-hmm. The idea that the Zappos could allow a customer service call to go on for 10 hours and 29 minutes because that's one of their points of differentiation. That would be unheard of by so many people. And then the first draft of anything is not so great, quoting Hemingway.
Yes.
And the last one, if the path is clear, you're probably on someone else's. And I just thought those were just some great sort of lines to remember.
Well, I've been accused of overusing quotations in some of my writing, but I guess I think that well, first of all, so many people have expressed ideas in far more elegant, memorable ways than I have. So there's a little bit of stealing or riding on the coattails of others, and there's lots of good stuff. Maybe I'll put out a book of ones that got left on the cutting room floor because I had quite a lot of quotes I was trying to work in, and some of them, fortunately, my editor said, it's a great quote, but you're trying a little bit too hard here to get this in.
How do people get in your world, learn more? What would you like to close with?
Sure. Well, I'm pretty active on social media, particularly LinkedIn. And I have a website. So on most social media, I'm at Stephen with a V, the correct way to spell it, according to my mother. P as in Peter Dennis, Stephen P. Dennis. And my website is stephenpdennis.com. So yeah, I'm active on most of the socials, and certainly can reach out to me through my website.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us and for writing the book. I think
Sure.
it might provide a necessary boost of courage for many a wavering manager.
Hopefully, with any luck, yes. I say, I steal from Hamilton a little bit and say, summon up all the courage you require, and get ready to leap. But yes, I do think any kind of innovation transformation work is fundamentally courageous work. So yeah, it's hard to think about how, it's great to have lots of great ideas and pipeline of innovation, but ultimately you got to have the courage to take that first step. And sometimes it's a small step, and sometimes it's a little bit bigger.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Of course.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.